Hey everyone, welcome back. Happy Sunday evening for me. Probably not till Monday till you're getting this video from me. Anyway, it's been a long weekend for me. I hope your weekend has been fruitful, productive, relaxing maybe, at least not terrible. It's been really hectic for me. I've been playing catch up ever since the quarter began, but I'm just doing what I can, catching up as well as I can here. Let's get into the rest of week one here at the end of week one. Really quickly, a couple of announcements. First of all, you'll see I've put Zoom office hours in the Zoom scheduler over here on the left. You can also see that they're scheduled here on the right. There's nothing to do there, but you can go and log into Zoom. I'm still in the process of making sure that no one can Zoom bomb those meetings, which is going to require you to sign in with your UW account, but everyone at UW has a Zoom login credential, so you should be able to just use your same UW credential that you sign into Canvas with to log into Zoom. As a matter of fact, I'm not quite sure how well Zoom is integrated with Canvas, but you might be able to just go straight through that Zoom link there and not have to log in twice. However it works out, we're going to figure it out. Not too worried about it. But I do look forward to the chance to chat with you all, maybe share a cup of coffee virtually or whatever beverage you're drinking at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and discuss some of these issues and ideas in the class with you or answer your questions as they come at you. There's also an assignment coming up here on the 9th, and I'm going to spend some more time introducing that. I won't do any time tonight because I really want to get into the readings that were assigned for week one that we haven't really covered in that much detail. So let me get the presenter view here, drag that out of the way, and then we'll see if I can get any better at getting my head out of the way. There I am, I'm down in the corner. Okay, good. So I need to remember maybe my head will pop over that little part there, but it's fine. There's two major textbook related readings for week one. The first is Wheelan Chapter 1, which really just sets the scene for the rest of his book, but gives us a good idea about the utility of statistics. And I want to keep this class, even though we look at a lot of negative examples of how statistics are misused or abused, we always want to keep in mind that we can do really important, valuable, legitimate things with statistics as well, which is why they're useful at all to us. So I think it's a little too easy to get a dark view of statistics are always flawed or often abused and forget that they can be very, very valuable and useful to us as well. I think Wheelan does a great job making the case for the kinds of statistics we use and the kind of statistical reasoning we use to help ourselves, help other people, motivate policy, evaluate policy, these kinds of big problems and their solutions that we work on. The other reading I assigned is from Joel Best, from his book Damned Lies in Statistics, and it's really good. I almost adopted the entire text as text for the whole class, but I thought Wheelan was really better for an all-around primer on statistics. Primer, I guess, is the way British would say that, but it's okay. So, to review Wheelan really quickly, Wheelan talks about different parts of statistics that we're going to go through for the entire quarter here. So this is just a big overview. We start out with descriptive statistics, which is a way of condensing a whole lot of data into one number or a set of numbers. We'll be working on descriptive statistics to understand data, big complex sets of data in assignment one. Inference we start talking about later on in the class, but we get into elements of inference, like, for example, if we ask 1,000 people who are randomly selected from a population, does that tell us much about the millions of people they were selected from? And the answer is yes, it does. And the reason is because of the logic of statistical inference. We'll get into that later in the quarter as we go. About the middle of the quarter, we start talking about, actually just after the first unit test, we start talking about probability and how we can use the laws of probability to make estimates of relative risk, relative payouts for business decisions and that kind of thing. It's a really useful logic to understand. And then in the middle of the quarter and towards the end of the quarter, we get into correlation and regression as ways of thinking about how different things might be related and even making some guesses about cause and effect. We will talk about at length how correlation does not equal causation, and yet it's very useful for understanding possible relationships and at least serving as the basis of inquiry, if not being used to help confirm some of the suspicions we have about the world. So to summarize Wheelan's chapter 1, he talks a lot about what things statistics are good for, and there's a whole list of them here. I've just covered some of them already, but in short, we can use statistics to give us a good summary where there's too many numbers to possibly understand all of them, so we come up with a summary of them. For example, an average income, an average household income, a batting average, an earned run average. All these are statistics that give a summary number to a lot of very widely ranging numbers. One that's really relevant to a lot of college students is a GPA. The grade point average is a statistic that summarizes all of the classes you've taken for college credit with an earned number grade. So these single numbers do a decent job of summarizing a complex set of numbers. The probability analysis I referred to earlier is a good aid to decision making in a lot of domains. Not perfect, but nothing ever is. And a lot of people rely on probabilistic thinking to help them make good decisions. Answering social questions is going to come up again and again. I really like joining the best chapter 1 reading with the Wheelan chapter 1 here, because Wheelan gives some examples of social questions, like some examples like the Gini coefficient for inequality, but the best examples are Joel Best's examples, not the best examples. If you know what I mean. The examples from the best reading I think are really good as well. Things like the number of prostitutes in New York City 130 some odd years ago, right? The issues around whether a social problem is a big problem or a small problem is a really relevant question today as much as it was more than 100 years ago. Catching cheaters or catching criminals using statistical methods. This is something that a lot of forensic scientists end up doing, figuring out how to identify whether there's a pattern or not. There's algorithms now that people, a lot of different companies, banks try and identify fraud before it gets out of control, but based on suspicious patterns of activity, for example. Evaluations of programs and evaluation of policies is really important, and we can use statistical analysis for that. There's a whole chapter at the very end of Wheelan on program evaluation that we're going to get into. It's really exciting stuff, and we need to figure out whether what we're spending money on and spending time on is effective or not. And that's why we evaluate policies and programs. And then last in Wheelan's list, but I think very important and also very important to best, is the idea that we need to have a good understanding of statistics, not only to do all these good things, but also to call out the abuse of statistics, either bad statistical reasoning or right out deliberate deception using statistics. So let's move along here. Moving into the best reading now, we need to think about this problem of policy or program evaluation. If we have a social problem and we want to resolve it, we need to know, first of all, how severe the problem is. So we need to have a measure of its severity. We also need to know whether it's getting worse or improving, and we also need to know whether a policy is helping solve the problem or not. I pray that I don't need to really lean too heavily on the current example of the coronavirus pandemic to be a great illustration of all of these questions. So there has been a really vibrant and often acrimonious debate in the United States about how severe the problem is. I've seen it raging on Twitter. I've seen it raging on Facebook. I try and stay off Facebook, but I go lurk there once in a while, just in the name of research. I'm sure you've encountered it sooner or later. My I'll tell you what, last quarter in this class, when I was teaching this class, I was talking about precautions for coronavirus, and I was explaining to my students how I was getting ready to move online if that became necessary. And I had a student say straight up, "This is silly. Only a few people have died. They're all old, and it doesn't matter. There's nobody here is sick. Let's just keep going." And I disagreed, but I tried to remain respectful about it because that was a prevailing, quite common attitude from a lot of people in the United States at the time. This was, a month ago or so. I think most people have changed their risk perception of that a little. Not everyone has. We'll look at some examples in the coming week here of people not changing their attitude on that quite as quickly as others. But is the problem getting worse or improving? Well, we've had statements about that on coronavirus as well. As a matter of fact, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, President of the United States of America, was on video, on tape a while ago, saying that the current number of cases in the United States was 15 and it'll be 0 very soon. So if that was the case, then there's no response necessary, right? But obviously it's not the case, so maybe response is necessary. So this is a question that we ask with a lot of social problems. And then last and very essential for us to resolve here is, did a policy help solve the problem or not? We are right now, it's April 5th as I record this, and we are right now on the cusp of discovering whether the social isolation policies that a lot of states put in aggressively and early will pay dividends or not in terms of slowing the rate of infection and slowing the peak surge of severe cases that require hospitalization and ICU treatment. That's the key question we're trying to resolve from a very clear public health perspective, right? My hope is that we'll start seeing that peak decline eventually, but right now is when we're supposed to be hitting the peak for the places that started earliest with these social isolation places like Seattle and King County and even all of Washington that have been more or less shut down for about 2 weeks. Obviously hasn't been perfect, obviously has been done at a great economic cost, but with the goal of really limiting the absolute chaos that would happen if the infections were allowed to spread with normal activity. That question remains open though, because we can't look into the future, and so that's where we're at right now. Is did the policy of social isolation and shutting down all non-essential businesses to promote social isolation help solve the problem, or did it not? That's what we're in the process of discovering and measuring right now. I really like Best's description of what a social statistic is here. His definition is that a social statistic is a numeric statement about social life. And we think about these numbers as measuring something that was really concrete. We've always been taught and trained to think of numbers as absolute, but Best does a great job of explaining to us how that's not at all the case. Best explains how social statistics are created, first of all, by humans that are trying to measure a problem and argue that the problem is getting worse or not. And so the measures that they choose are inherently, potentially, or not inherently, but are subject to their own biases, all right? And second of all, the way we measure them can affect the numbers that we get. So these numeric statements about social life are helping us answer these questions that we're asking about social problems. So I've alluded to this already. I won't spend over long on it now. If we have policies developed and evaluated based using statistics, then statistics become politicized. And that's really evident in abundance with the current coronavirus crisis, where suddenly Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's been really front and center in the as part of the face of the national response, as an expert in respiratory diseases and infectious diseases, and he's seen as an expert by many people, but he's also seen as a problem, to put it frankly, to a lot of other people. So we have statistics and somebody who's arguably trying to do his job as a public health official suddenly become politicized because people care a lot about what the policy is or is not, and then have a political motivation to either believe in the statistics or discount the statistics. So we need to be very careful about, anytime we see a statistic, who's using the stat and how are they using it and why are they using it. This is a politically involved event, right? This brings us into what I was really admiring Best for just a minute ago, which is this creation of social problems by social groups. There's a whole bunch of groups, social activists, mass media, experts, government officials, businesses, foundations, you name it. The media gets involved in the creation of social problems, right? I'm not saying the media is always biased, but there's definitely things that media choose to cover and choose not to cover. And so that then creates that creates a definition of the social problem. So we have social problems then competing for the public's attention, different agents, different activists, different groups trying to make their social issue, the one that they care about the most, bigger than the other one. So there's this competition for attention, this competition for salience. People want their own particular issue to be the one that's cared about the most important, that gets funded, that gets responded to, that gets their solution put in place. And I love this quote from Best. And so I don't like to read a lot of quotes to you all, but I'm going to read this quote from Best to you, which is, promoters use statistics as ammunition. They choose numbers that will draw attention to or away from a problem, arouse or diffuse public concern. That quote is preeminent in the debate over whether coronavirus is a real issue that we should care about in the United States, or whether it's all just a bunch of hype, panic, nothing to worry about. It's just a tempest in a teacup, right? Right there, that quote does a great job of explaining what's going on right now in the debate over coronavirus, as people are using statistics as ammunition to either make the problem seem really big and growing, or really minor and insignificant and not worth worrying about. Why does this happen? Why is it that people use numbers selectively or select their best statistic as ammunition? The answer is the problem of public innumeracy. The general public doesn't have a really good idea about what statistics mean. They don't have a good understanding of different statistical measures and their advantages and disadvantages. They don't understand the sheer size of numbers. Most people couldn't tell you right away how many times bigger a billion is than a million, right? Which is just, I'm not trying to shame anybody. These are facts about an innumerate American public, right? And other places in the world as well, by the way. But at the same time, we have a lot of innumerate people that are also too embarrassed to admit they're innumerate. And so then when you're confronted with a claim that has a statistic in it, if you don't know about the statistic, then it's really hard to say you don't believe it for a reason. You tend to just say, oh, okay, there's a number, I guess it must be true, right? People are getting a little better about just rejecting numbers that they don't believe in some ways, but also just because they're getting really politically polarized, so they don't trust any number. They're like, well, if the number's from the enemy, I don't believe the number, right? Which is not what we're trying to be about in this class, or we shouldn't be about in life, if you ask me for my opinion. Best gives a number of examples of problems with official statistics. I'm going to leave you to read through all the examples in detail, but things that we think of as really just absolute concrete numbers, he points out lots of cases in which there might be a little wiggle room, right? So even births and deaths, if you don't give birth in a hospital, then the birth isn't necessarily recorded. If you die and the coroner doesn't file a report, then that doesn't count as a death if no one finds your body. Marriage, lots of people have common law marriages, and for all intents and purposes are married. Is it the act of being married that makes you married, or is it the act of filing a marriage certificate in the county clerk's office that makes you married? So this is the question we're asking, right? If we're interested in counting these things, how do we count them? Death by suicide is another interesting case where maybe the coroner has a reason to not counted as a suicide and counted as an accident. Or maybe the person who committed suicide didn't want it to look like a suicide, and they chose a way to die that looked like an accident so that maybe they could get an insurance claim, right? So that's a difficult thing to count. Domestic violence is another example where we don't have really reliable statistics on domestic violence. We'll come back to this example a little bit later here with another best reading. But the challenge with domestic violence that Best points out is that do we count a domestic violence incident as any time the police are called? I mean, there's certainly domestic violence cases where the police aren't called. If the police are called, but the police diffuse the situation, in other words, they sort of get things calmed down a little, but maybe not resolve it, but calm down a little, and they don't make an arrest. Or maybe the police come, and then they ask the victim if they want to press charges, and the victim says no. Do we count that? Or is it only when the police make an arrest that we count as a domestic violence? The way we count it can really change the number of things that we count, is the message here. Domestic violence is one of these things where not only has the way we count it been changing, but also our definition of what counts has been changing. We'll come back to it, as I said. One more example, deaths by coronavirus. Let me switch to that really quick here. I put this up in our modules. There's a story out today, and I linked to it here in Unit 2 of Week 1, which is this story in the Washington Post. I get ads. I love ads. Americans are almost certainly dying of COVID-19, but being left out of the official count. So this is a product of a lot of different sort of the perfect storm of combining factors, which is that people who are already old and already suffering from medical frailty of some sort or another, maybe COPD, maybe a weak heart, maybe some other chronic medical condition, puts them at risk for being more severely affected by the COVID-19 virus. And so already frail people that catch this virus then are more likely to die from it. But the problem is that we don't have effective widespread testing. So if someone dies at home and there was no one there to observe their symptoms until they died, they were discovered when someone checked on them, or maybe someone noticed they were not doing very well, but they went to bed and the next morning they didn't wake up. Do we count that as a COVID-19 death or not? Well, you want to test for it if you're interested in finding out if it's COVID-19. But we don't have enough testing capacity to the point where doctors are rationing the tests to only test people that they don't want to have going out in public, or to monitor if they're going to get really a lot worse if they're still alive. So a lot of places are seeing testing a body as a waste of a good test, right? And I can empathize because it's a valuable thing and there's not enough of them and we need more of them. Let me rant a little bit here. So what do? Do you count it as a COVID-19 death or not? And the short answer is that there's a lot of people dying that we don't know whether COVID-19 contributed to their death or not. There might be some clever ways of doing it statistically long after the fact by seeing if there was an overall increase in the death rate. But that would be really tough to tease out at the margin. And the short story here is that this is a great example of how something we think of as really absolute death is really difficult to actually figure out whether it was caused by the thing that we're really interested in monitoring or not, which is the causes of death of this newly spreading epidemic. All right. I've already summarized this point in brief here, which is that the way we count things, classify things, define a problem affects how many of that thing we count, whether it's deaths by COVID-19 or cases of domestic violence. It's a socially mediated count. And so the point that Best is making here is that statistics aren't just measuring social life. Statistics are socially created. That is, the social problems are socially created, and the way we measure them is the product of society. which is an interesting thing to think about. So hopefully we're getting sufficiently philosophical here for those of you who are interested in that part of the class. Best has this great conclusion that I think is a great take-home for us for this lecture, and I'm going to end it here. I'll come back and do another little mini lecture on the additional readings to week 1, part 2. There's a bunch of newspaper articles that are relevant besides the one I just shared with you. But this is a good spot to end it for tonight, which is Best brings this summary up here, which is you should always ask who created the statistic, because you want to be at least knowledgeable about the source. And if it's somebody who has a history of lying, then you probably don't want to trust that source as strongly as somebody who's been forthright from the beginning. But if it's somebody who's motivated to benefit from the statistic, you want to be very curious about their motivations for it, right? Which is getting to the second point here, which is why was it created? And then third, how did they create it? So one of the things to be really skeptical is when you see a statistical claim, but you can't answer those questions. So if someone gives you a stat about, did you know that X number of people did this thing in their lives? And it's amazing how often you'll hear that. People say, did you know that? It's a fact that so much and such, and they'll roll off some statistic. And you're like, but is that true? And who made it? Why did they make it? And how did they create it? And if you can't answer those questions, then you should be very skeptical of that statistic, because we end up with these numbers just repeated sometimes without understanding where they came from, why they came from, when they came from sometimes, right? The number that these numbers get in our head sometimes. So, for example, 72 cents on the dollar is a number that is very often given as the difference between women's and men's pay. But that number hasn't been 72 cents through history, right? So we still do see a biological sex-based income gap. It's not to say it's gone away, but over the years that has been shrinking a little bit. Maybe not as fast as people would like, and that's fair enough to say, but we want to be skeptical anytime we hear a number just given out as pure fact without any supporting evidence about where did it come from, why did they make it, or how did they make it. These are really important questions to ask to understand statistics in a savvy consumer sort of way. That's a good spot to leave it for tonight. I hope you found that useful. I don't know about entertaining, educational, I hope. I'm going to leave it there. I have this video up in the lecture notes. I'm not going to show you the video now because what I do with this is in class, when we have a whole group there in class, is we watch this video. This video has been around. This is a good example of a video that uses some statistical claims. He does cite the source. He cites the UN as the source of the data, and we can presume the UN used data on generated data on world poverty because they're concerned about alleviating world poverty. I don't think that's an unsafe assumption in this case. But he makes some statistical claims about the percentage of people in poverty in the world and the US's immigration policy. This video is fairly old now. It's like 10 years old or so, but I keep seeing it. It makes the rounds on social media every now and again. In that respect, it's a little timeless. Anyway, I'm not going to play it for you now, but see if you can watch through it, and then if you want to leave me a comment below or email me or hit me up during office hours, see if you can figure out what I think is the problem with this video. See if you can read my mind on this a little bit. And it's a little bit of a challenge because it really isn't, it's not meant to be a gotcha, but it's also not super obvious what my big problem with this video is. But I like to have a little discussion around this video in class. We watch the video and we have a discussion, and it's usually really generative. We talk a lot about the numbers and what they mean and where he's coming from and what his position is, what his motivation is, that kind of thing. With the speaker, this guy, I think his name is Roy something. Anyway, if you want to watch it, feel free. If you don't want to watch it, it's okay too. But that's a little challenge for you. See if you can guess what Tim's thinking in looking at this video using a statistical argument to advance his cause. I am going to end it there. I can't think of anything else that I want to say right now, which means it's probably a good time for me to say goodbye. Thanks so much. I'll see you online soon. I'm going to post the Chapter 2 module tomorrow on Monday and get some readings up in there as well for you. And I'll see you virtually online. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.